Transdispensational, that's really not a word. So although a lot of dispensational people use that word. So we don't want to go there and use that. That's a phrase or a word that people will kind of make up in order to say that you can take something from one dispensation and just equally plug it into another dispensation and it's just good to go. And everyone's doctrine doesn't matter. It's all the same. You can just take it out, put it in, and that doesn't, it's just not going to work like that. What we see here in, say, Psalms, it's been composed over 1,000 years by such people as Moses, David, Solomon, Asaph, Ethan, the sons of Korah, and so many more people. It's got 150 Psalms in it, in this entire book, but it breaks up into 5 books. And so if you've ever thought about, why 5 books or what's going on with these 5 books, it also goes on, if you think about where do we also come up with that phrase of 5 books? When you think about the first 5 books, you think about the first 5 books of the Bible, and then you also have 5 books in the book of Psalms. So you'll see book 1 is Psalm 1 through 41. You've got book 2, Psalm 42 through 72. Then we have book 3, Psalm 73 through 89. Book 4 is Psalm 90 through 106, and book 5 is Psalm 107 through 150. So we get, of course, those 5 books mentioned there. Commonly, as you go through and you study and see what the core of what they're talking about is, or the bulk or the main part of what these 5 books are going to be talking about, you can actually line them up and see that they're the heart of the message, or a lot of the core of the message that's being taught in each one of these books will kind of line themselves up with each one of the first books of the Bible. Book 1 will kind of have something to do with Genesis in that it's synonymous with, for example, you'll see the initial separation of the righteous from the wicked. You see that Abraham and the patriarchs did their part in Genesis, being separated and so on. And even in Psalm 1, you'll see something talking about how in Psalm 1, say verse 1, it says, "Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful." And then it goes on talking about the ungodly, and blessed is the man that doesn't walk in them. So you've got the righteous from the ungodly, and they go on to talk from there. And so we see that here, and then in Psalm chapter 1, verse 6, goes on to read, "For the Lord knoweth the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish." And so there's this separation being spoken of about the righteous from the ungodly in the book of Psalms. So, and it goes on from there. It's not just Psalm 1, but it continues, that theme, that idea continues on just in what we call the Genesis Psalms and in book 1. And as it continues, you go into book 2, Psalms 42, going into 72, and will be called the Exodus Psalm, after book 2, and the Pentateuch, so to speak. And that's going to go on and talk about the suffering of those that live in tribulation, who will cry out to God. Just as you can read about that in, say, the book of Exodus, you'll see that theme come up also in Psalms 42 through 72. And so that theme kind of pops up and comes into fruition in, say, book 2, the Exodus Psalm. So it goes on through there. And as you move into book 3, which we saw, as we mentioned before, Psalms 73 through 89, that's going to build into your Leviticus Psalm, or Leviticus Psalms, where it's going to be more of this return to Israel as a people. And it's going to be, their interests are in view, their history is even in view. And it's going to be more of a stabilization for Israel. So they'll talk more about in these specific Psalms, Psalm 73 through 89. You'll see more about Israel and their history, and the Psalms that represent that. And it's going to talk more about the stabilization, the return of Israel, and this will take place in these Psalms here. In Psalm 90 through 106, as we mentioned before, that's book number 4. That would be your Numbers Psalm. And just like in the book of Numbers, you'll see God's millennial government layout and provision, information, And that, you don't find that in the book of Numbers as far as the millennial government layout, but you do find provision and information for people. The reign of Messiah also gets laid out in these books as far as Psalm 90 through 106. And then that last one is Psalm 107 through 150, which would be the Deuteronomy Psalms. Commonly after a theme where you find the summary, resummation of God's ways, and Israel praises God for all that he's done. And so there's that resummarization, just like Deuteronomy is that resummarization of the law again. You read that in based on how Leviticus was the first mentioning, Deuteronomy is the second mention. So we kind of get a basic theme, just as those first 5 books have some commonality. These 5 books have commonality with those 5 books. So that's where these themes come from. That's why these things kind of pop out. So it comes through there. And then when we study the Psalms and we rightly divide it, of course, we're going to read this as a prophetic book. We're not going to plug in the body of Christ into this book. We're not going to preach Christ according to the mystery in the book of Psalms. We're not going to go in and do things like that and mix prophecy with mystery. We know that much. But we also see that something that we're going to look into is that in the book of Psalms, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is considered the future from this book, as is what we were looking at before a couple weeks ago, the day of the Lord, or Daniel's 70th week, or the events of the book of Revelation. That's also from this perspective, their future as well, from the book of Psalms, which is through the timeline of God. It's about the book of 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, King David and his day, and so on and so forth. So from that perspective, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is the future. The day of the Lord is the future. The book of Revelation is the future. So we're going to see the perspective of where this book is at in the Bible timeline. And also that when we study the dispensation of promise and everything that has to do with that, that's going to be the past for the book of Psalms. So when we put that, pinpoint it into the Bible timeline, that's where we see that there. But also a helpful reference is what I would like to call the rule of double reference. And what this is kind of a new feature concept, is when you go in and you read the book of Psalms, or you study the book of Psalms, and we rightly divide it. Of course, we're going to put that into Israel under law, but we can do that in 2 points. We can reference it in a double manner. And here's what I mean by that, is of course you'll take it literally in King David's day. And King David, as he writes, most of these Psalms, you'll see that he's going to be talking about the issues in his day concerning, say, Absalom, who takes over his kingdom, and other, the Philistines, his enemies, and things that happened to him in his day, and things will happen from the perspective of King David. You can also go and read about what happens concerning the Jews that are faithful to King David, and so on and so forth, Jews that praise the Lord, and so on and so forth, from the perspective of the time of King David in the book of Psalms. The rule of, say, double reference is you can also go and read this from the perspective of the little flock going through Daniel's 70th week. And while they have Hebrews through Revelation as their main point of reference, as their main point of doctrinal information, they can also go back and they can read what's going to be happening through the book of Psalms, and you can kind of go back and rehash and look at the Psalms through their perspective. And I've got a couple Psalms as a reference to kind of look at that and see what I mean by that. You can call it like double fulfillment or double reference. So they'll be looking for information as they go through the events of Matthew 24. Just as King David is writing this, as he's going through his events, it's kind of like history's repeating itself. And I'll show you what I mean by that. If we look at, say, Psalm chapter 6, we'll start there. And in Psalm chapter 6, we'll say in verse 1, verse 1. And let's see. We can read, it's going to be more so of a plea for help, and we'll see it from the perspective even of King David. So it's going to go forth and we read this from King David's perspective. We read, O Lord, rebuke me not in thine anger, neither chasten me in thy hot displeasure. Have mercy upon me, O Lord, for I am weak. O Lord, heal me, for my bones are vexed. My soul also sore vexed. But thou, O Lord, how long? Return, O Lord, deliver my soul. O save me for thy mercy's sake. For in death there is no remembrance of thee. In the grave who shall give thee thanks? I am weary with thy groaning all the night. Make I my bed to swim. I water my couch with my tears. Mine eye is consumed because of grief. It waxeth old because of all mine enemies. Depart from me, all ye workers of iniquity, for the Lord hath heard the voice of my weeping. And he continues on from there. King David talking about how he's fighting his enemies. He feels that he's weak. He's pleading out for help. And we're seeing King David talk about this, how he's pleading for help for the Lord from the vanquishing of his enemies. So we see that there. We can go back and double reference this again. If we read all about what the little flock needs to know and what they need to do, say Matthew 24, refer it to Hebrews through Revelation, and see the things that they'll need to be saying or see from the perspective of their mindset. We go back to Psalm 6 again, read that from verse 1, from a perspective of the little flock, fleeing into the wilderness, avoiding the mark of the beast, avoiding the Antichrist. And again, the same thing, you could read it from that perspective and saying, "Oh Lord, rebuke me not in thine anger," because the Lord will come in Revelation 19:11 in his anger, looking to rebuke his enemies. It says, "Neither chasten me in thy hot displeasure. Have mercy upon me, O Lord, for I am weak, and they'll be weak." We know all about that from Matthew 5. "O Lord, heal me, for my bones are vexed. My soul is also sore vexed. But thou, O Lord, how long? Return, O Lord, deliver my soul, will save me for thy mercy's sake." And they're looking for the Lord to return in Daniel's 70th week, just as King David's looking for the Lord to return and vanquish him from the Philistines, or vanquish the Philistines from him, I should say. So we're kind of seeing this way you can refer it and see how there's, you can kind of gain some insight into the little flock, just as you can see this going towards King David in his day as well. And we can rightly divide all that. So we see a good benefit towards that. So we see that in the book of Psalms. And then we'll continue with that as well. It goes into a lot of Psalms are like this, where there's a double reference going on. We see that. Oh, let me clear this out of the way here. And we have Psalm chapter 6. It comes up quite a bit. You can see that in Psalm 14, Psalm 16, Psalm 23. That's the famous one that gets read a lot at funerals. We know we're not going to apply Psalms unto us today, so whenever we hear Psalm 23 at a funeral, we're not going to apply that to us. We have no purpose or reason to do so, but it's going to be the little flock going into their kingdom, and they'll be praying to God for provision. So we see that that's going to be one thing as well, as it is King David doing the same thing again. So we see that in Psalm 23 as well. It continues on with Psalm 43, Psalm 55, Psalm 120. It just continues on where you can apply studying and rightly dividing the Psalms, such as an example is this. And so we see that there. One thing we don't want to do, as we were just building into all this, is that we don't want to go ahead and sloganize the Psalms. And you'll see a lot of people, if we look at Psalm 37 verse 4. One of the things you'll hear a lot of modern Christianity do is they sloganize the Psalms. And if we go there, we look at Psalm 37 verse 4. It goes on to say something like this, as we rightly divide, say, the Psalms, and we put them into a proper perspective so we can gain stronger, further Bible insight from it. See where it fits in God's timeline, rightly divide it, and allow it to further help us in our Bible studies, based on whether it be looking back toward the dispensation of promise or looking forward towards Daniel's 70th week, and Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We're seeing in Psalm 37 verse 4, it goes on to say, "Delight thyself also in the Lord, and he shall give thee the desires of thine heart." And so now, how many times have we heard that being talked about towards getting your prayer promises, getting those things that you want, getting a new car, getting a new job, being given? If you delight yourself and know, if you show up for church every Sunday, God's going to give you exactly what your heart desires. That's how this gets spun. That's how these Psalms get twisted, so that you have to show up at a certain religious service every week in order for God to grant you these things, but of course we know we're not the people in the book of Psalms. We don't have a covenant standing with God. God blesses us irregardless when we trust his gospel with all spiritual blessings in heavenly places. So we see that from from Ephesians, number 1, with Paul's epistles, and we rightly divide that from the book of Psalms. But we see in Psalm 37, verse 4, that it's not about us, making wishes or prayer promises or so on and so forth, praying for that new car, new job, new whatever it is. We don't apply that into, the desires of our heart the way that we think we hear it or the way that it gets taught commonly. But we see that there in Psalm 37, as we read from verse 1 all the way down to verse 7, we see that it's going to continue on talking about, say, if we use that rule of double reference, we can read back and see this for King David in his day. We can also read this for the Antichrist, for the little flock going against the Antichrist in their day. But we see in Psalm 37, verse 1 says, "Fret not thyself because of evildoers, neither be thou envious against the workers of iniquity, for they shall soon be cut down like the grass, and wither as the green herb. Trust in the Lord and do good, so shalt thou dwell in the land, and verily thou shalt be fed. Delight thyself also in the Lord, and he shall give thee the desires of thine heart." So we're seeing how this is working out. He's talking about them, saying, "Fret not thyself because of evildoers, neither be thou envious against the workers of iniquity." Again, you're seeing this idea of righteous standing from workers of iniquity, just like we were seeing back in the first idea, Psalm 1. So we're seeing this difference between righteous and workers of wickedness or iniquity. But we're seeing it has nothing to do with this, with just making a wish and hoping it works. And so it goes forth talking about in verse 4, where we're seeing in verse 5, verse 6, "And he shall bring forth thy righteousness as the light, and judgment as the noonday." This is rest in the Lord and wait patiently for him. That's what they'll be doing when they flee to the wilderness. And we know this has to do a lot with Revelation chapter 3, verse 20, where it says, "Rest in the Lord and wait patiently for him." They'll be waiting, and then he'll knock on their door. And "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." That verse will kick in here. "Fret not thyself because of him who prospereth in his way, because of the man who bringeth wicked devices to pass." And it sounds like that can be either Absalom for King David, or that can be the Antichrist for the little flock of Israel. So when we see that there, we kind of plug in these verses and put them in context for whatever subject we're teaching for a Bible study, or however we're looking to rightly divide this towards subject matter we're learning from. So when we see this here and we keep rightly dividing Psalms, we're seeing that there in verse 7. And then it continues on from there, knowing that this has nothing to do with trying to make these verses apply to ourselves. It's anything but. So we see the kind of law of double reference kick in. We're seeing the context of which the Psalms are fitting in themselves into in relation to books in the past and books in the future. And it continues on as we go through this. And then we're seeing the reason why. When we see that in Psalm 37, verse 4, "Delight thyself also in the Lord, and he shall give thee the desires of thine heart," it's talking about God is their provider. He's going to give them the desires of their heart. And today, God doesn't work like that in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. He's not going to provide supernaturally. We know through 1 Timothy 5:8, we have to go out and provide. And if there's something we want, we have to go out and work for it. We have to go out and do what we need in order to get it. We have to, Galatians 6:7, we reap what we sow. If we don't work for it, we don't get it. If we work for it, we're more likely to get it if we work for it. So that's why we're not going to delight ourselves in the Lord, and we're just going to get whatever we wish for. And so we see the difference as we rightly divide the Psalms, that this book will be for Israel, and it has been for Israel. So we see that there. But another psalm, Psalm 46, verse 10. Psalm 46, verse 10, we see another one that gets used. It's commonly called transdispensational, but it's not. It's Psalm 46, verse 10. And what we see here, if you look there, it's going to be Be still and know that I am God, and I will be exalted among the heathen. I will be exalted in the earth. And so we see there's a phrase that you hear commonly gets sung in a lot of religious churches. Be still and know that I am God. And so a lot of people take that as a moment of, or a psalm, as literal practical instruction where they're just going to be frozen. They're not going to move. They're not going to do anything. They're going to just not literally move, but just to be still. And then they're going to know that if you spin it however you want to spin it, that Jesus is God. And that's a truth. There's no problem with that. But again, when we see there, be still and know that I am God, that's going to go back to whether it's King David fleeing from his enemies, hiding from his enemies. We read a lot about that in 2 Samuel. He flees from King Saul, he flees from Absalom, he flees from the Philistines, and he fights them as well. But we see that at times he'll have to be still and depend on God's covenant provisions. And we'll see that there with King David also, with the little flock. In Matthew 24, they flee into the wilderness. They go and they also hide. God will provide for them, as we know, hidden manna and other things as well. And that'll allow them to go through. And as they're hiding, they'll be still and they'll know that he is God, not the Antichrist. That Jesus is God, not the Antichrist. I will be exalted among the heathen. Well, that's true, because there'll be a lot of heathen during Daniel's 70th week doing the will and the work of the Antichrist. I will be exalted in the earth. And so we see that you can apply that rule of double application or double standard towards little flock or towards King David in his day when we study this. And we see there's a lot of ways where we can get into the mind better of either the little flock of Israel or go back and see what was going on with King David in his day. So we see this here. And we're seeing that if it's not going to anybody, it's not the church, the body of Christ today. It's not you, it's not me. So when we want to see what does Paul say about Psalms as we rightly divide the word of truth, where does the Psalms ever come up? We want to see Paul's direct instruction and information. If we're not going to apply any of this literally, because we're learning that this has to do with Israel and Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers, and we're seeing that this has to do with them, this has to do with their plan, their prophetic purposes. Where do we fit in with the book of Psalms? Because all the Bible's for us, and all the Bible we can learn from, and there's nothing wrong with that. If we go to Ephesians chapter 5, verse 19. Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 19, we find here, this is where Psalms come in. And we'll see this here. As Paul teaches the Ephesians, the church, the body of Christ, now here we are, he tells them, speaking to yourselves in psalms, there we are, in hymns and spiritual songs, and the purpose is singing and making melody in your hearts to the Lord, or in your heart to the Lord. So we're seeing the whole point and the whole benefit and purpose. If they were, or if anyone is, to use the Psalms, one purpose is to speak to yourselves in psalms, because there's a lot of Psalms where they're rejoicing in the Lord. Paul says that to the Philippians, rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say rejoice. If you're looking to find specific phrases or anything where you can rejoice in the Lord, we can go and find spiritual application. We can learn about how Israel will rejoice in the Lord and their plans and purposes, and we can learn a great way to rejoice in the Lord. We're just not going to rejoice in the Lord based on prophetic purposes. We can still speak to ourselves in Psalms, for example, and this is such an instruction to do so. We see that in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 19. If we look also at Colossians chapter 3, verse 16. Let's see, Colossians chapter 3, verse 16. We see here again, talk about the word of Christ dwelling in us as we study it, as we grow from it, as we learn more about it. We see here it says concerning the church, the body of Christ, and concerning the book of Psalms, its application, its purpose, what do we do with it today? So let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord. So we can sing with grace in our hearts to the Lord using psalms, and for the same idea we were looking at in Ephesians about rejoicing in the Lord. We also see there, letting the word of Christ dwell in us richly, teaching with psalms, admonishing with psalms. We see that they're admonishing, meaning to to warn somebody firmly about something. So there's a lot of instructions in the book of Psalms, as we have briefly gone over just a moment ago, about how Israel cries out in need of help, how they avoid the wicked, they watch out for the wicked, they have to beware of the wicked and the Antichrist and everything else. Those sort of things come up in the book of Psalms. And so you can admonish somebody using the book of Psalms, teaching them that it's a right thing to avoid the wicked or beware the wicked, and stand clear of the wicked, just as you can go into Genesis and talk about with Noah and the ark and say, we're not going to build an ark, but Noah did right by being faithful to God's instructions. So it's the right thing to learn from Noah and not build an ark. And it's the right thing to learn from the book of Psalms and see everything that King David's going through, or if you want to apply it to the little flock and say what the little flock will be going through and how they'll be thinking, and say it's the right thing to learn from the book of Psalms. It's the right thing to study it out and see the great understanding of the book of Psalms. We can learn from them. We can learn quite a bit from them. And so we see that there in verse 16, that we can have the word of Christ dwell in us richly in all wisdom. Now, and all wisdom literally means all wisdom. We can go and we can learn prophetic wisdom and learn from it and understand that there's hidden wisdom in 1 Corinthians 2:7 that applies to us today, which is now revealed, the mystery of Christ. And then there's wisdom from Solomon, wisdom that goes on in prophecy that we can also learn from and benefit from. And it's all God's wisdom. We learn about that through there. We can also see an example of Paul using the book of Psalms to teach Israel. And so he's even going to quote the psalm. If we look at Acts chapter 13, verse 16. Acts chapter 13, verse 16, you'll see Paul just flat out say, this, here's a psalm for you, Israel. I'm going to teach you using it. Acts chapter 13, verse 16. And let's find it here. I believe this is it here. Yeah, he says, I got the right one, 16. He says, then Paul stood up and beckoning with his hand said, Men of Israel, and ye that fear God, give audience. The God of this people of Israel chose our fathers and exalted the people when they dwelt as strangers in the land of Egypt. With an high arm brought he them out of it. And about the time of 40 years suffered he their manners in the wilderness. And when he had destroyed 7 nations in the land of Canaan, he divided their land by them by lot. And he goes on explaining the details of the history of Israel. And then when we go through it, we get to verse 33. He's going on and explaining everything. He says in verse 33 of Acts 13, he says, God hath fulfilled the same unto us their children, in that he hath raised up Jesus again, as it is also written in the second psalm. Thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee. And as concerning that he hath raised him up from the dead, now no more to return to corruption. He said on this wise, I will give you the sure mercies of David. Wherefore he saith also in another psalm, Thou shalt not suffer thine Holy One to see corruption. So Paul's using the Psalms to teach Israel, just as we see him talk about this to the Ephesians, and he says this also to the Colossians, that this is how you can use the Psalms. You can use the Psalms to teach people about, in this case, Jews, as Paul is doing in Acts 13, about their history. This is how the Psalms work. This is what the Psalms are meant to provide information to and how they work. So he's doing this for them, and we're seeing an example of that. And we can go forth and do the same thing as well, learning. Not everybody is going to need Jewish information per se, but we can also, as we said before, teach how the Psalms work to show that you should avoid the wicked. You can teach someone about Israel's history. You can go and teach otherwise as needed, because there's going to be a lot of cults that use the Psalms, and they use it to twist everything into their personal agenda. So we see that there. And we also can see If we go to 1 Corinthians chapter 14, and that's a big chapter that comes up with a lot of different issues, especially for Pentecostalism. But 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 26. Let's see what we'll get into there. What he tells the Corinthians is that they're supposed to be edifying each other. They're supposed to be building each other up in the faith, helping each other out through, whether it be through study, through all sorts of different things. And instead he tells them, he says, how is it then, brethren? In 1 Corinthians 14:26, he says, when ye come together, every one of you hath a psalm. So he's saying, hath a doctrine, hath a tongue, hath a revelation, hath an interpretation. Let all things be done unto edifying. So he's teaching them, because this is a book of rebuke. 1 Corinthians is a book all about rebuking the Corinthians. And he's essentially saying, every one of you has a psalm. Every one of you has something. Every one of you has something, and you're not edifying one another. So he's saying that you guys have a psalm. You may have a psalm, but it's not being used for the purpose of edifying, for teaching and for warning and for rebuking and for building each other up and helping each other out. You're just using these things and you're throwing these things around. You all have a revelation. You all have a psalm. You all have something that you want to throw at each other without helping each other, essentially. And so he goes on and he goes on talking about tongues and so on. And goes on from there. But we're seeing this is how Paul is using the Psalms and how we therefore would rightly divide the Psalms, using it for our benefit, learning about Israel, seeing how it works in the past, seeing how it'll work towards in the future, how it can work for us in today's day, knowing that all the Bible's for us and not all the Bible's to us. But we can study all the Bible and it can benefit us. It can benefit us greatly. So we see that there. But as we went through before, we just touched on this briefly a moment ago. The Psalms can also be used in correction for the cults, because almost every funeral you'll hear Psalm 23. That's Israel going through the tribulation, but for some reason they teach that, or they just make that something that you have to hear at a funeral for some reason. So it's put out of context, and that's somehow made to be your loved one receiving, being brought through pastures and so on and so forth, making me to lie down in green pastures, that type of thing. So that gets twisted out of context. Even in different religions, of course, what counts to be the Jewish religion today, they of course will say that that's their history. They'll say that's their literal history, and they're going to run with that, and that's not going to work out, because when you say, is Jesus your Messiah, they'll say no. Do you teach the 613 points of law today? They'll say no. That's not what this book teaches, though. So they're running contrary to the Bible, except when they pick and choose. And even if you go into the Islamic faith, they call Psalms, they call it Zabur. So you can find that in all their different surahs. And they'll say Surah 1755 is going to be something about Psalms, but they won't call it Psalms, they call it Zura. Zabur. So you'll see it come up there. Evangelicals will take the Psalms, and you can go into any evangelical church or even Pentecostal church, and you'll hear them turn it into devotionals. And they'll not take it literally and apply it towards the little flock. Neither will they apply it towards King David in the past. They'll apply it to themselves, and they'll do the Psalm 37:4 thing, where they say, trust in the Lord, and you can just have the desires of anything you want, and apply it towards your heart and do everything that doesn't work. So we see that there. And then it just continues on, and that's just the book of Psalms. So what I'll do is stop for a minute and see if anyone has any questions just on the book of Psalms. We didn't even get into the book of Proverbs yet. I want to see if there's any thoughts before I go any further. So let's see if I have enough to go through the Proverbs. But we'll try to go through this real quick. See if we have enough time to wrap it up in this lesson. I'd have to do it in about 20-25 minutes. So I'll try to wrap this or go through this as quick as I can. And maybe I should save that for next week, because I could turn this into a whole hour too. Um, well, we'll try it. We'll try it. See, with Proverbs, I might even run into next week with this. Proverbs, if we go to Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 1, we'll go there. We looked at the Psalms rightly divided. We just did a broad brush. We just kind of went through it real quick. But if we look at Proverbs, as we go through Psalms, now we go through Proverbs, as we go through King David and his book, which relates to 1 Samuel or 2 Samuel. Now we're looking at Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 1. When we go through this, a lot of people, the evangelicals and so forth, they like to go to the book of Proverbs and they say, well, I'm going to go and I'm going to obey that book now too. And a lot of people say, well, that's also trans-dispensational. That's not true. And that's a word people make up. You can't take these things and apply it. And here's why. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 1 says the literal prophetic purpose of this book. And we see in Proverbs 1:1, it says, the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. Well, it says who it's written to. It's already going out to Israel. It says, and the reason is verse 2, to know wisdom and instruction, to perceive the words of understanding, to receive the instruction of wisdom, justice and judgment and equity, to give subtlety to the simple, to the young man knowledge and discretion. It says, a wise man will hear and increase learning, and a man of understanding shall attain unto wise counsels. To understand a proverb and the interpretation, the words of the wise and their dark sayings. And of course, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Of course, we've read this before. We've probably seen this before. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 1 through 7. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 8 and Proverbs chapter 1, verse 10 says to whom it's written to specifically. And of course, everyone learns it from there. But we see in verse 8, it says, my son, hear the instruction of thy father and forsake not the law of thy mother. So we see in verse 1, the Proverbs of Solomon, King Solomon. So we see in verse 8, he's writing to his son, my son. Well, the son of King Solomon is King Rehoboam. So we see he's writing this to King Rehoboam. It's a Jewish king. It's one Jewish king who's the father, writing to the other Jewish king who's his son. And all of Israel gets to read this book. And we see that this is a book under law, written to Israel, from one king to another king, as he passes things on, and we see it go on from there. We can see more about King Rehoboam if we look at 1 Kings chapter 12. We'll kind of go there. We'll kind of broad brush through him real quick, being a little bit short on time. And we might just find a stopping point and continue on this next week. But 1 Kings chapter 12, we go there real quick. Trying to find the main part that he's known for here. We see in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 1, here's King Solomon's son. Here's why he needed a lot of wisdom, because he messed up so badly. He didn't have what his father had. And it says, and Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel were come to Shechem to make him king. And it came to pass when Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who was yet in Egypt, heard of it, for he was fled from the presence of King Solomon, and Jeroboam dwelt in Egypt, that they sent and called him. And Jeroboam and all the congregation of Israel came and spake to Rehoboam, saying, thy father made our yoke grievous, and now therefore make thou the grievous service of thy father, and his heavy yoke which he put on us lighter, and we will serve thee. And he said unto them, depart yet for 3 days, then come again to me. And the people departed. And King Rehoboam consulted with the old men that stood before Solomon his father while he yet lived, and said, how do ye advise that I may answer his people? And I'll kind of zoom through this, but essentially, instead of consulting with the wise older men about how to consult them and to comfort his people as he becomes the king, he consults with the youth, the younger people that say, chastise the people you're going to be ruling over. And as he does so, out of the 12 tribes of Israel, 10 run away and start their new kingdom. And only 2 stick with King Rehoboam. So he splits the 12-tribe kingdom into 10 going north and 2 going south. So he does this, and essentially you've got 10 northern tribes break away and form the kingdom of Israel. And Rehoboam has the kingdom of Judah, the 2 tribes, essentially. But as we continue, and we see that's to whom this book is initially written to. He says, my son, in Proverbs chapter 1, verse 8, my son, in Proverbs chapter 1, verse 10, and then all of Israel gets to study the book as well, and we do as a benefit as well. If we look at Proverbs chapter 3, verse 1, we also get to see that not only is this a prophetic book in Israel, written from a Jewish king to another Jewish king, but we see it's also a book under law, and we know from Romans 6:14, we're not under law. In Psalm chapter 3, verse 1, it says, Lord, how they are increased, they that trouble against me. I'm sorry, that's the Psalm. Let me get over to another book here. One book behind, sorry. We see in Proverbs, that's when we get to the right book, maybe, that would help. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 1 goes on to read, my son, forget not my law, but let thine heart keep my commandments. That's the commandments he's received, that Moses received from God, the 613 commandments, which built in there are the 10 commandments. So he's going to say, forget not my law. You go to Proverbs 4:2, it says, for I give you good doctrine, forsake ye not my law. And you get the law again. So when you hear in some evangelical church or some church of some type how they love to obey the book of Proverbs, they can't. They can't obey the book of Proverbs. They can learn from it, because we can learn from all the Bible. There's nothing wrong with learning from any part of the Bible unless we learn from it. But you can't obey everything that you find in the Bible, especially when it's not written to us. We can just learn from it. And there's nothing wrong with learning from it. So we see that just as we see it in Proverbs 3:1 and 4:2, and I'll just give out the verses. It also comes up in Proverbs 6:23, Proverbs 13:14, Proverbs 28:4, and Proverbs 28:7. And so we're seeing more so kingdom wisdom. You can see that for the little flock living in the kingdom, they'll get all these proverbs they can learn from. Or we can see this in Solomon's day as he builds up that kingdom that King David started. He builds it up and it flourishes to its utmost. To the greatest part it does before it tanks. And they get carried away into 70 years of Babylon, and Babylonian captivity. So we see how this can also be done as well, but also in the Proverbs, just as we saw in Psalms, the future of Proverbs is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The future of Proverbs is Acts chapter 2, just as it is also in the book of Psalms. And the future of Proverbs is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Hebrews through Revelation. One thing you see that doesn't get taught very much as far as the future of Proverbs being Acts chapter 2, if you look at Proverbs chapter 1, verse 23, you find here Acts chapter 2. We see in Proverbs chapter 1, verse 23, he says, turn you at my reproof, behold, I will pour out my spirit unto you. Sound familiar? That's because you find that in Acts chapter 2. And if the church is too busy making themselves Acts chapter 2, not to see Acts chapter 9 or anything else, why wouldn't they look at Proverbs 1:23 and think that they're the people in Acts chapter 2 and misidentify themselves and not rightly divide the book of Proverbs with anything else and misunderstand it? So we see there in Proverbs 1:23, I will pour out my spirit unto you. And he eventually does so, Acts chapter 2. I will make known my words unto you. And he does so throughout progressive revelation. So we see that there. But he's forecasting Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He's forecasting Acts chapter 2. We just saw that. And he also continues to forecast the day of the Lord, millennial kingdom, Hebrews through Revelation, and continues to there. Let's see how much time we have left. And we still got some time to keep going, so we'll keep going from here. A good way to study the book of Proverbs, you can go verse by verse, and we can read it, line for line, proverb for proverb, and that's not a problem there. What we can also see is you can study it topically. And what I mean by that is you can go through and study the book of Proverbs, and you can find, per se, a topic about anger and wrath, or you can go through and find the topic of wealth, or the topic of children, or the topic of all sorts of things, adultery, or the foolish, or the wise, or whatever it may be, and you'll find these topics all throughout the Proverbs. You'll find one in one chapter, a couple of lines in one chapter here, a couple of lines in one chapter here. And what I mean by that, for example, if we go to Proverbs chapter 3, verse 30, if you want to do a topical study and see what is going on, say if you're doing a study on anger or wrath. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 30 goes on to say, strive not with a man without cause, if he have done thee no harm. You know, we're talking about strive, or striving, wrath and anger, that type of idea. If you go then to Proverbs 9:8, you're skipping over 6 chapters. Proverbs 9:8 goes on to read, reprove not a scorner, lest he hate thee. Rebuke a wise man, he will love thee. So again, talking about wrath and so on, when to reprove and when not to reprove, so you can watch out for the wrath and the anger coming your way. You can see that there. Then if you go to Proverbs 11:23, the point of why we're doing this is you're seeing that you're finding a topic, and you're seeing as you go through and you look for specific verses referring to a specific topic, you'll see it come up, say Proverbs 3, Proverbs 9, Proverbs 11, Proverbs, and so on and so forth. But Proverbs 11, verse 23 says that the desire of the righteous is only good, but the expectation of the wicked is wrath. And so we see that the expectation of the wicked is wrath. So you see more about wrath and anger. And as you study everything together, and you put the verses together in order to formulate ideas and themes, whether you're doing a topical study one way or another. Again, you want to rightly divide the information, put it towards what you're looking to do your study on, and you're finding ways that you're doing, if topical study is the way you're headed, you rightly divide it, you put it into its proper prophetic audience in this case, understanding to whom it's written to, and you go forth and do a study on it. And you can not only do it on anger, but you can find verses talking about all sorts of things. And you just take out different verses and line it up accordingly. So we say that that's another way to study, say, the book of Proverbs. But even in the dispensation of grace, when it comes to wisdom, we find all sorts of things that Paul talks about that is not in the book of Proverbs. And that's one thing we talked about earlier. If you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 7, this is why when churches only focus on getting wisdom from the book of Proverbs and they don't go to Paul, they're missing out on the fullness of the revelation of God. And that would be 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 7. 1 Corinthians 2:7 goes on to read, but we speak the wisdom of God, and there's that wisdom of God that comes up so much, but they speak in a mystery, even the hidden wisdom. So we're finding wisdom that was hid when Solomon was around, when Proverbs is written. Now we're having the hidden wisdom revealed. This is which God ordained before the world unto our glory, which none of the princes of this world knew, for had they known it, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. So we're finding that with Paul, in Paul's epistles alone, if you're looking for that deep, rich wisdom, you go to Paul and you study Paul and you learn all about what Paul has to say, because he's going to reveal God's entire timeline to you, rightly divided. As it's commonly called in Ephesians chapter 3, verse 10, the manifold wisdom of God. So we can go back and study Solomon, what the wisdom that God gave to Solomon, and the wisdom that God gives to different people at different places at different times. There's nothing wrong with that. But when we see it in the big picture through what God gives to Paul, we see it, the manifold wisdom of God. We see it as the manifold wisdom of God, Ephesians 3:10. So we see that come up there. And it's all talked about in Ephesians chapter 1, verse 8, and I'll just give out the verses. Colossians chapter 1, verse 9, Colossians chapter 2, verse 3, and Christ is all the treasures of wisdom. Colossians chapter 3, verse 16 comes up, Colossians 4:5, we want to walk in wisdom. We want to walk in that wisdom. We can learn a lot from the book of Proverbs, as long as we understand this was literally for Israel. And that's why we find, and I think this is where we're going to wrap up, that's why we find, if we look at 1 Kings chapter 3, we come across what we find as King Solomon. 1 Kings chapter 3, I'll find the exact verse in just a moment here, what I'm looking to find. And I think it's going to be in verse 5, 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 5. When you find about how did King Solomon get such wisdom? We're again talking about he's a Jewish king in the prophecy program under law in the covenant relationship with God that we're not in. And he says in Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night. And God said, ask what I shall give thee. And Solomon said, thou hast showed unto thy servant David, my father, great mercy, according as he walked before thee in truth and in righteousness and in uprightness of heart with thee. And thou hast kept for him this great kindness, for that thou hast given him a son to sit on his throne as it is this day. And now, O Lord my God, thou hast made thy servant king instead of David my father, and I am but a little child. I know not how to go out or come in. And then he says in verse 9, give therefore thy servant an understanding heart to judge thy people, that I may discern between good and bad. For who is able to judge this thy so great a people? And the speech pleased the Lord, so that Solomon had asked this thing. God said unto him, because thou hast asked this thing, and hast not asked for thyself long life, and so on and so forth, the wisdom that Solomon prays for is granted to him. And so we see this work out for Solomon here, because it's the prophetic program. They have a covenant standing. What he prays for, he gets, which is familiar if you remember James chapter 1, verse 5. If we go there for a moment, this is where this verse plugs into for the little flock of Israel. And we're wrapping things up here, so don't worry, we're just about done. But in James chapter 1, verse 5, as we rightly divide the Proverbs, and as we just previously rightly divided the book of Psalms, James chapter 1, verse 5 goes on to read, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God. And that's what Solomon did, because he's Jew inside of a covenant, inside of the Old Testament. And we're seeing these are Jews in the New Testament. We're in neither one of them. He says, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that giveth to all men liberally, and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. So we see that there. Let him ask in faith, nothing wavering, for he that wavereth is like a wave of the sea, driven with the wind and tossed. And so he goes on, through there, talking about how a double-minded man, is unstable in all his ways. So that comes up through there. So when it comes to wisdom today, how do we get wisdom in the dispensation of grace? We know that through 2 Timothy 2:15. Study to show thyself approved. If we want wisdom, we have to dive into this book. We have to study it out. We have to apply truth upon truth, rightly divide truth in some cases, grow into the knowledge of God, the dispensations of God, understand what he's saying, to whom he's saying it to, and we rightly divide the word of truth. We have to study. We have to dig into this book and learn and grow and understand what he has to say to whom he says it to. So we see there is a difference between King Solomon and all of Israel being able to ask, and it's just going to be given to them. And that sounds familiar too. That's a Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John verse, versus us who have to go in and study the words on the pages and learn and grow and understand how things work as we rightly divide Psalms and as we rightly divide Proverbs. Now, hopefully this helps out as we kind of look back at the dispensation of grace and kind of learn from those books. And as we look forward to what we just went through a couple weeks ago with the book of Revelation, and we see how these all kind of fit in to God's timeline, plan, and purpose. So with that, we'll wrap up and see if there's any questions on any of this, whether it be Psalms, whether it be Proverbs. If anyone has any thoughts or comments or questions, and hopes that this helped you with growing in your study of the Bible as a whole.
The study was very clear. I was very surprised. I did not know that there were 5 books in Psalms. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
That'll help my studying a little bit.
Yep. Yeah, no problem. Yeah. Yeah. Is there any other thoughts or comments on anything? Yeah, that commonly comes up where people will, rather than learn from, say, the book of Psalms or the book of Proverbs, and learn from it, or spiritually apply it, understanding it's spiritually applied, it's not literally applied, they'll go to a psalm or a proverb of their choice, whatever it may be, and they'll say, I can literally apply this equally, just as King David could do it, just as King Solomon could literally apply this in his day. I can do the same with this psalm or this instruction in my day. And if he can do it, I can do it. And that means I can transpose it, I can translate it, I can move it around, I can take what he has and plug it into my day. So it's essentially like saying Romans through Philemon, in its proper context, and this psalm over here, or these couple psalms over here. So transdispensational is where people think that because the verse sounds right, we can literally apply it. And there's nothing wrong with learning from it. There's nothing wrong with understanding that it's right to, as we said with Noah, it's right to obey God. It's right to be faithful to him. We're not going to literally apply anything that happened to Noah. So that's the idea. That's the idea of transdispensational. Sure, no problem. So any other thoughts or anything? So if that's it, we'll move on to either doing a part 2 on this, or we'll continue with other. I've gotten some topics that's been sent my way. We'll move on to other topics, and I hope this has helped out with kind of diving a little bit deeper into context with different books of the Bible. And we can keep doing this. We can keep going forward with this. So we're just looking forward to as you go through the Bible, you learn from the Bible. The Bible helps you with the Bible. And you kind of see the different perspectives, the different possibilities of growing and learning and rightly dividing the word of truth. So I'm hoping that these topical lessons help out as we all grow together. So yeah, we can wrap up here, and then we'll be back here on Wednesday.
It sounds great. Thank you, John.
Yeah. All right. Yep. Grace and peace. We'll see everyone later.
Yes, everybody have a good week.